Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a story that feels both intensely personal and strikingly universal.
Hmm.
It's the extraordinary journey of Martin Chartrand. Just picture this. A Canadian citizen, someone who you'd think could move freely, now living for 5 years undocumented in Mexico.
And not by choice, right? That's the
Well,
key. It's
yeah.
circumstance.
Exactly. Circumstance and, well, deeply held conviction. It's this really modern narrative of exile, I think, and incredible resilience against, the backdrop of global events.
Yeah, and what's really compelling, I find, is how his story, which he titles Stateless in the Shadow of Empires,
Hmm.
isn't just about, where he physically is.
Right.
It's more about how one person's principles, really deep-seated principles, can collide with these huge societal shifts, government policies, state power.
And he ends up navigating this world that just, bit by bit, refuses to recognize him, pushes him right to the edge of what belonging even means, what freedom means, really.
Absolutely. And to really get the full picture, we're focusing mainly on that primary testimony, Stateless in the Shadow of Empires.
Okay.
But we're also going to pull in insights from some of his other writings. They're quite powerful. Spikeopathies, Flame in the Bone, for instance, gives this medical context he sees as vital.
Ah, okay, yeah. That sounds intriguing.
And then there's Martram, a destroyed artistic and political project. That one helps uncover this recurring pattern in his struggle for recognition that actually goes way back, decades even.
Wow. So it's not just a recent thing for
Not
him.
at all. So using all these helps us see not just what happened, but maybe why it matters and how his personal story might reflect, bigger truths.
Okay, great. Let's start unpacking it. Where does this journey begin?
Well, it starts over 5 years ago. He calls it a self-imposed exodus.
Self-imposed, so he chose to leave Canada.
He did. It sounds like an incredibly difficult decision, but he felt he had to leave. He was seeking refuge, his words, from what he describes as totalitarian medical mandates.
Okay, so this is firmly rooted in the COVID crisis response.
Exactly. Those sweeping public health policies.
Yeah.
He felt they created this environment of coercion and control that just fundamentally violated his sense of personal autonomy, his core beliefs.
So a system he presumably trusted just became oppressive in his eyes.
That's how he frames it. Leaving felt like the only option to maintain his integrity, essentially.
And think about that. A Canadian citizen, someone you assume has the right to return, an identity that's recognized. But he specifically says he's living now as an undocumented person in Mexico,
Yeah.
a citizen in name, but without rights, recognition, or recourse. That's quite a statement. What does that actually mean to be exiled from the bureaucracies of both nations? It's more than losing a passport, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's a chilling reality, really. For most of us, citizenship is it's the foundation, right?
Yeah.
It gives you rights, access, a basic sense of belonging. But Chartrand describes a situation where that foundation just crumbles away. Being undocumented in Mexico, while technically still a Canadian citizen, it puts you in this bizarre legal limbo, a void,
So no formal work, no bank account, no health care.
pretty much, or at least extremely difficult to access any of that formally. Your entire existence, because this constant negotiation, you're relying completely on informal networks, on goodwill. It's survival turning into resistance, and that resistance paradoxically leading to this state of exile. Bureaucratic limbo, basically.
And his arrival in Mexico, it wasn't like he was going on vacation.
Not at all. It was urgent. He talks about returning to Playa del Carmen, to a hostel he knew where a friend was staying. He calls it a re-entry into an underground refuge.
Underground refuge, that phrase says a lot.
It does. It immediately signals he's looking for those informal channels, places to exist beneath the official radar. Not comfort, but invisibility and safety.
And how did he start to integrate, even informally?
Well, personal connections were key early on. He mentions attending a friend's wedding down in Mahawal, and he describes that as an unofficial re-anchoring. Like the first time since leaving Canada, he felt part of something again, a human connection outside the state machinery.
That makes sense.
Then, back at this place, the Boho Hostel, this opportunity comes up. His friend, who was running it, needed to go to Cozumel for a new project
Right.
and asked Chartrand to manage the hostel while he's gone.
Okay, so like a job offer.
Not exactly, and this is crucial. Chartrand really stresses this point. Not formal employment, no contract, no paperwork, nothing official.
But significant nonetheless.
Hugely significant. He calls it a critical vote of trust. In this world that was basically refusing to acknowledge him, this informal gig gave him a meaningful, stabilizing role.
So he wasn't just hiding out anymore.
Exactly. He says he was contributing, stewarding a space, moving from just surviving day-to-day precarity to actually having a purpose. It was a lifeline, really, when all the official doors were shut.
Okay, but how was he managing financially through all this? He left Canada. You said he wasn't getting support.
Right. And this is where it gets, well, really stark. When he first got back to Mexico, zero financial support from Canada, no access to social programs, none of the COVID relief that many citizens were getting back home. He was purely relying on what he calls a small reserve of personal savings, stretching every single peso, acutely aware that it wouldn't last. Already a really precarious situation.
And then came the turning point in 2021 you mentioned earlier, the quarantine rules for returning Canadians.
Yes, the mandatory quarantine protocols. But the real kicker, the barrier he highlights so strongly, wasn't just the rules themselves, it was the cost.
The hotel fees.
The outrageous hotel fees, as he puts it, often over 2,000 Canadian dollars for just 3 nights in one of these government-designated hotels.
$2,000 just to go home.
For him, that was completely prohibitive. Impossible, he says it flat out. I was economically locked out of my own country.
So not legally barred, but practically barred by the cost.
Precisely. And that's what shifts his situation into what he calls being a stateless person in practice. Maybe not technically stateless by law yet, but in reality, yes.
An involuntary and indefinite exile.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Marked by those dwindling savings, relying on informal work, barter, goodwill, solidarity networks, whatever he could find.
You know, this really makes you question what citizenship even guarantees if the state can just price you out of returning.
It's a profound point he makes, isn't it? It reveals that really thin line between being a citizen in name and being stateless in practice. Reality that probably affects more people than we realize.
So this de facto statelessness, this kind of practical exile, how did he respond? Did he just resign himself to it?
Not exactly. It seems like his survival instinct kicked into another gear, almost transforming into a form of resistance after managing that hostel for 5 months, unpaid service, mind you.
5 months unpaid, wow.
Faithful service, he calls it. Handling everything, logistics, guests, maintenance, even the emotional labor of holding that community space together. After all that, he decided to take a leave of absence.
To do what? Just take a break?
No, not just a break. He says it was to honor a deeper one, the duty to document what I had lived through.
Ah, so to write.
Exactly. He retreats to Palenque, finds this rustic jungle lodge where time feels liquefied, sounds quite evocative, and starts writing Fear and Loathing in Tulum.
Like Hunter S. Thompson.
He directly cites Thompson as inspiration, The whole gonzo journalism thing, subjective, first person, the writer and the story.
Right.
But Chartrand makes a key distinction. His gonzo was by necessity, not style. He wrote it in sweat and candlelight, with no editor, no contract, just a raw outpouring.
So the writing itself became a form of refuge.
That's exactly how he puts it. His asylum when borders refused me one. It was his way of grounding himself, bearing witness, asserting his existence when the world seemed intent on erasing him.
Okay, so he finishes writing, comes back from Palenque. What happens then? Savings must have been even lower.
Critically low. He says upon return, his savings were almost gone. Like, enough for maybe a few more weeks of basic survival or a plane ticket out, but definitely not both.
That's cutting it fine.
Extremely fine. He was initially welcomed back to the hostel he'd managed, again relying on kindness on those networks, but it forced him to strategize. He was right on the edge, but instead of giving up, he found this, well, unconventional path.
Which was?
Not through money, interestingly, but through solidarity. He reconnected with a dear friend, a woman he mentions lives with spina bifida.
Yeah, okay.
She was also struggling, looking for a more spiritual path. They decided to meet up again in Tulum, which seemed to hold significance for both of them.
And what was his role in this new setup?
His role was providing skills she needed. Technical skills, time, emotional support, companionship. He helped her restart her podcast, setting up the tech, editing, publishing, guiding her. Often just in exchange for food and lodging, maybe small donations from her listeners.
So not a business deal, more like a mutual support pact.
Absolutely. A pure pact of survival, he calls it. He paints this picture. Surviving together in the middle of a collapsed global economy. 2 stateless souls in a jungle city with no safety net.
Wow.
Living donation to donation. No contracts, no power dynamics. Just trust, struggle, and improvisation. He stresses it wasn't codependency, but a horizontal alliance of the precarious.
It really shows how people find ways to support each other when formal systems fail, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Resilience born from desperation, you could say.
But you mentioned this alliance frayed after about 6 months. What happened there?
Yeah, it did start to fray. And this is where a really core personal boundary for Chartrand comes crashing into the situation. It links directly back to why he left Canada in the first place.
The mandates, the health concerns.
Exactly. The whole COVID situation,
Mhm.
and specifically his deep unease about the potential effects of the spike protein, from the virus itself or the mRNA vaccines. This was still a major concern for him. He talks about having developed his own intuitive warning system. And it's apparently screaming one thing very clearly. Avoid sexual contact. Avoid exchange of bodily fluids. Avoid entanglement, basically.
So he made a decision not to become intimate with her.
Yes, a very clear, principled choice based on his survival logic and health beliefs. But inevitably, this decision created friction.
I can imagine.
He mentions unspoken expectations, emotional complexities just bubbling under the surface, and the end result. It cracked our fragile alliance, he puts it bluntly. I lost a friend, but I kept my boundary.
That's a tough situation, sticking to your principles even when it costs you a vital relationship.
A profound cost, especially given his already precarious situation. It really highlights the personal toll of holding on to those convictions, and it foreshadows some of the deeper medical ideas we'll touch on later from his other writing.
So that chapter ends, and he's presumably back to square one.
Almost immediately, no. It's quite remarkable how things seem to flow for him sometimes, even amidst the chaos. He says the moment that alliance ended, practically seamlessly, he was scooped up by Asylum.
Asylum.
Yeah.
Another hostel or community.
Sounds like a guest house or maybe a community space. And it wasn't like a formal hiring process. He describes it as more organic, like his presence fit. The person managing it voluntarily was leaving.
Right.
And Chartrand just sort of became the new manager in spirit, almost by default.
Manager in spirit, what does that entail?
He calls it an unexpected adoption by the actual manager, who he describes as a gypsy at heart. Someone who saw something in him, perhaps. He wasn't there to fill a specific role, but more to anchor the energy of the place.
Interesting.
So he stayed, found this informal purpose again. He calls it a custodianship of vibe and vision. An upgrade he felt from just surviving to subtle stewardship, from being cast out to being quietly claimed. It sounds like, for a while, it offered that sense of purpose he craved.
I sense a but coming. Things didn't stay idyllic at Asylum.
Unfortunately not. Despite being the caretaker in spirit, he says he had next to no say in the actual running of the place, of finances, the operations.
Oh.
And the business itself was apparently in serious trouble. Failing, bleeding resources, as he puts it, drifting badly. He proposed some radical, costly measures to try and save it.
Which were?
Ignored. Consistently ignored by the owners, he felt. Then came something he later recognized as a soft exile.
Soft exile. How so?
Well, it was presented as a new opportunity. He was sent away, placed in another hostel to launch a new venture back in Playa del Carmen.
Okay, sounds potentially positive.
But in hindsight, he saw it as a quiet sidelining, a way to get him out of the picture at Asylum without a direct confrontation.
And did he ever go back to Asylum?
He did, 6 months later. And what he found was, well, quite striking, almost a betrayal, you could say.
What was it?
Every one of my suggested changes had been implemented. All those radical ideas he'd proposed, the ones they ignored when he was there, they'd done them all.
But without him?
Without him. Without any credit, any acknowledgement. His presence was erased, but his insight was retained. He describes himself as becoming a spectral consultant to a house I once helped carry.
Ouch. A ghost of his own contributions. That's rough.
It really is. And this feeling, this experience of being cut out, having his work used but his presence erased, it wasn't actually new for him.
Ah, this connects back to the Martram writing you mentioned.
Exactly. It echoes very strongly with past experiences he details in Martram, a destroyed artistic and political project. He talks about his earlier identity as Martram, the author of a book called Putsch Pop.
Okay.
And he describes the deliberate destruction of his career and public image after a specific television segment back in 1998 on a show called Blackout.
What happened on the show?
According to Chartrand, the program used things like misleading editing and possibly even undeclared actors to paint him a known literary and political figure at the time as just some kind of social profiteer, ignoring all his previous work and visibility.
Wow. And he sees a pattern here.
Yes. He draws a direct line to another incident involving Vice magazine later on, arguing it's a recurring pattern of media organizations using deceptive strategies and denigration for sensationalism, discrediting voices that challenge the mainstream, essentially.
Did anything come of the complaints about that TV show?
He mentions institutions like the CRTC, the Canadian Broadcast Regulator, and the Quebec Press Council did find journalistic misconduct. But crucially, he argues they offered insufficient redress or sanctions.
So no real accountability.
That's his claim.
Yeah.
And that lack of accountability, he says, led to lasting consequences for him, including contributing to his exile and loss of credibility, which resonates profoundly with his current statelessness and feeling erased now. It's this consistent theme, fighting for recognition against systems that seem built to distort or deny his reality.
Okay, so after the Casa Lamb experience and the sort of soft exile, he was sent to launch a new hostile venture. How did that go?
It started with promise, apparently. He was present, committed, and hands-on in getting it set up in Playa del Carmen.
Good start.
But his partner in the venture quickly opted out. Seems they were too scattered, unreliable, couldn't really commit to stewarding it properly.
Not ideal.
And the actual owner of the property was also absent, disengaged. This led to what Chartrand calls administrative blind spots. Basically, mismanagement, missed payments, debts piling up.
Uh-oh. He'd seen this movie before, right?
Exactly. He recognized the warning signs immediately. Rather than get dragged down with what he saw as a sinking ship, he decided to jump ship, quietly and cleanly.
Right.
Got out before it all collapsed around him.
Smart move, maybe, but leaves him adrift again.
It does. And what does he do? He chooses to return to the jungle for another 2-month round of writing.
Back to the writing as refuge.
He calls it spiritual triage this time. In a world with no contracts, no government recognition, no safety net, the only sovereignty he felt he had left was the page. A way to define his own reality when everything else felt out of control.
And was he heading back towards Tulum after this writing stint?
That was the plan. Tulum seemed to be his perceived promised land, a place he felt a connection to. But, as he puts it, the system had other plans.
What happened?
He was on a bus, leaving Palenque after his writing retreat, heading towards Tulum. And during what sounded like a routine inspection stop, boom, he was detained by Mexican immigration authorities, INM.
Oh, wow. After all this time under the radar.
Exactly. The reality of his situation hit hard. He was undocumented, my passport had expired, I had no valid visa and no official status. He was caught.
So no longer just stateless in practice, but officially in the hands of the state.
Precisely. He describes that moment vividly. The collapse of your autonomy in the public sphere. The system had finally touched him directly. No longer beneath the radar, he was inside its net.
That must have been terrifying. What was custody like?
What's really striking is how he felt unseen, invisible in a different way. He says to the immigration officials he wasn't Martin Chartrand with his complex 5-year story. He was just another lost tourist, a stranded rich kid.
They assumed he had money, connections.
Exactly. Assumed someone would bail him out, credit card, parents, embassy. He says, no one asked about my story, my intent, my fear, my status. No one asked if I was seeking political asylum.
Did he consider asking for asylum?
He says he didn't volunteer it because I knew it wouldn't matter. They weren't interested in his why.
To saw him as a category, a problem to be processed.
Right. He contrasts their assumption of privilege with his reality, those 5 years of stateless wandering, unofficial labor, economic precarity, creative service, and spiritual exile. He says he didn't need bail. He needed recognition. But the system just sorts passports, assumes the rest, a total bureaucratic erasure of his journey.
How did he get out of detention then?
It was quite abrupt. After 3 days, he was suddenly told he was being released before midnight.
Any reason given?
He believes it was triggered by his flat-out refusal of a medical inspection.
Refusing medical intervention again. Consistent with his principles.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He links it directly back to his reasons for leaving Canada, the very biopolitics of medicine.
Right.
A fundamental distrust of state-mandated health procedures. So refusing was non-negotiable for him.
And they just let him go?
Not quite. They gave him papers granting safe passage to the border with the United States within 1 month.
So basically deporting him north.
But in a very hands-off way. He calls it bureaucratic erasure, an elegant push into limbo. No transport arranged, no support, just dumped him, essentially.
Where did he end up?
Standing alone on the cold, unforgiving floor of the ADO terminal, in a major bus station. facing this incredibly stark choice.
Which was fly to Tijuana, cross into the U.S.
That was the implied option. Fly to Tijuana, cross on foot, and immediately become officially branded illegal in the U.S. system.
But he didn't want that.
No. Even exhausted and stateless, he didn't want to trade one cage for another with more cameras, swap one form of state control for potentially even more surveillance.
What did he choose?
He chose Tulum, the place that had held me before, his spiritual refuge. His decision on that cold floor was clear. Go back to Tulum. Try one last time to resolve things there before letting another system swallow me whole.
That's incredible defiance, really. Choosing self-determination even then.
It really underscores that relentless pursuit of personal sovereignty, doesn't it? Refusing to be erased or controlled, echoing those past struggles from his Martram days. He wouldn't just follow the path the system laid out.
So, back to Tulum one last time. Did he find refuge there?
Initially, yes. After a short stint in just a basic hostel, he says his prayer was answered when someone named Milana appeared.
Milana? Who was she?
He describes her quite poetically. A visionary, a founder, a fallen queen of Cenote Tixel. Apparently one of Tulum's original pioneers, someone pushed aside by all the commercialization that swept through, represents an older, maybe purer Tulum ideal.
And she took him in.
Yes. And significantly, he felt she saw him, not as a problem, not as a liability, but as a presence she could house.
That must have been a huge relief.
A reprieve from invisibility, he calls it. Her place wasn't just shelter. It was like a chapel of lost empires, holding on to beauty amidst the chaos. And his role there wasn't just to stay, but to contribute, again, to hold space, to listen, to rebuild.
So he found ground beneath his feet again.
For a moment, yes. Offered in recognition, not pity, which was crucial for him. A spiritual alignment, it seems, despite his ongoing undocumented status.
But you called it a bamboo mirage earlier. It didn't last.
No, sadly. It looked perfect. The sacred cenote, this amazing bamboo structure, the implied role of steward. There's even talk of lawyers getting papers sorted, making it official, finally rooting his exile into something stable.
Sounds promising.
But as he puts it, the promise dissolved into vapor. The meetings to formalize things just never happened.
Why not?
He started to realize the underlying dynamic. He wasn't really being set up as an owner or even a proper manager. He was more like a stand-in, a loyal occupant keeping the space filled, maybe preventing someone else hostile from taking over. Essentially, a human paperweight.
A human paperweight. That's quite an image.
Isn't it? Just holding the energy, preventing others from moving in. And then he discovered the uncomfortable truth. No one's paid rent in a year or two. The whole setup was built on shaky ground.
So he was caretaker of another collapsing vision.
Exactly. The lone rational witness, he says, in a place built on half-truths and postponed reckonings, valued only for his static presence almost.
What happened to this collapsing vision then? Did it just fade away?
Pretty much. He says the queen folded, Milana just vanished. Not dramatically, but a quiet abdication, leaving the palace vacant.
And then?
Then arrived her most valiant defender, along with two eerily obedient children. And suddenly, Martin Chartrand, the human paperweight, was just in the way.
So he got kicked out?
Effectively, yes, but again, no formality. He calls it an unmarked eviction. Just driven into town one day and told to fend for myself.
No papers, no money, no explanation.
Nothing.
Yep.
No papers, no compensation, no closure. He makes this point about the powerlessness. There's no grievance process when the system is a bullocracy. No tribunal for displaced dreamers. No paperwork for emotional eviction.
Just cast out.
Cast out by a structure that was collapsing anyway, too afraid to admit it wasn't real anymore. Another stark reminder of the vulnerability when you exist completely outside formal systems.
Okay, so he's stranded. Again, no roof, no funds.
What does he do now? Give up?
What does he always do? He hustled hope. Found another potential opportunity, this time with a production company. For a brief moment, it looked promising a chance to use his creative skills, rebuild.
Right.
But the temperature changed, quickly. Word had gotten out about him in the Tulum scene.
What kind of word?
The labels started sticking undocumented, unstable, unplaceable. Difficult. He became essentially a non-person in a town run by PR illusions. Persona non grata.
Blacklisted. Socially blacklisted, yeah. The jet-set gypsies, the crypto yogis, the eco-spiritual elite, as he calls them. They distance themselves, whispered, erased him from their circles.
And he feels this wasn't because of his work, but
Because he outlived the myth they built their empires on. He didn't fit the narrative anymore. And again, this echoes right back to the Martram experience, right? That loss of credibility, the defamation campaign.
the struggle for recognition just keeps repeating itself, even in these informal settings.
It seems to be a persistent, painful theme throughout his life. The power of reputation, social perception, and how easily one can be erased.
Okay, where does he go from being persona non grata in Tulum? This sounds like rock bottom.
What comes next is, well, the timing is just tragic, as he describes it, an impeccable tragedy. News reached him that someone he knew from the old network, a friend, a helper, connected to someone still dear to him, had been assassinated just weeks before.
Assassinated? Good heavens!
Yeah. He knew the man, paid his respects quietly, but couldn't attend the funeral. No money, no means to travel. But the woman who both he and the deceased man had helped, she knew his desperate situation.
The woman he had the pact with earlier. The one that frayed.
No, I think this is the one from the initial pact, the friend with spina bifida he helped at the podcast. Let me recheck the source. Yes, it seems likely it's her, given the context of shared history and support networks. He felt compelled to call her, despite everything.
What was he hoping for?
He wasn't sure. Rescue, reproach, recognition. He was just completely out of cards, at his absolute limit.
And how did she respond?
She was, as he describes, raw, shaken, visibly fractured by the death of her ex-right-hand man. And he, returning to her sphere, wasn't a savior this time. He was a survivor stretched thin, lightheaded from hunger, fragile from years of undernourished endurance. His body itself bore the record of bureaucratic silence.
So two people really at their breaking points?
Exactly. He felt he was too familiar to reject, too worn to threaten. And so over the next few years, they forged this new, unlikely alliance.
Based on what this time?
Not based on agreement, but on need. She needed his skills, technical insight, creativity, his ability to hold things together. He needed her infrastructure access to a home, networks, a fragile base to operate from.
Survivors helping each other survive?
Pretty much. Two survivors of parallel burnouts, he calls them. Her, dealing with grief and health issues. Him, frayed by exile, starved by lawlessness, ghosted by the state.
Was it romantic? Or just practical?
Not romantic, he clarifies. Not utopian. Just real, functional. The complementarity was undeniable. They filled each other's gaps out of necessity. He provided the tools and clarity. She provided the space and platform. Another adaptation, another way humans find support when traditional structures vanish.
But even necessary alliances can have friction. Were there tensions in this new setup?
Oh, yes. Significant tensions. He describes outright class warfare erupting within the household.
Class warfare. Between who?
Primarily involving a helper who was rehired. This helper apparently started systematically stealing from their shared food budget, even food meant for the hostess's elderly mother who was living with them.
That's awful. How did Martin handle that?
His role became incredibly practical and stressful. I had to skate to Chedraui on my rollerblades to bring the week's worth of foodstuffs and stretch every peso to feed 3 people. He just kept my head down and did my work. Amidst the conflict, trying to manage the household budget under impossible circumstances.
Did the stealing stop?
Eventually, yes. After numerous covert moves and foiled attempts, the helper was finally dismissed, and Chartrand was effectively promoted to full household management.
And during this time, was he recovering personally, physically?
He dedicated himself to it. He mentions regaining nearly my full strength through over a year of ninja yoga beach training I imposed on myself, along with weight training, using water buckets.
Real DIY resilience.
Building himself back up literally. The hard way, manually, with intention, he says. He contrasts this with his hostess's strength, which he felt came more from his keto-influenced cooking and some light exercise. She apparently acknowledged his role. The house ran because I held the spine of it. He was the anchor.
Okay, so things are functional, if tense. What about the bacalar interlude you mentioned? A vacation.
It was presented as a vacation for her, her mother, and her accountant. But for Chartrand, it hardly felt like one. He remained in a service posture. He says he didn't mind, it was expected, but it solidified his role as part caretaker, part ghost.
Still not quite fully seen or integrated.
Seems that way. And after that trip, he says, a silent tension grew. He'd made a video for his social media, joyful, scenic, maybe a touch provocative, hoping it might attract romantic interest for her. But it didn't pan out. And the core of the growing tension, as he perceived it, was her sense of dwindling desirability, which somehow started to orbit around me.
How so? Because he was there.
Because he was there, living in her house, A man in top physical shape, fully capable and yet deliberately withholding affection.
Ah, back to the intimacy boundary.
Exactly. And he explicitly states his withholding was out of principle. That vow he made, not to become intimate with those vaccinated with mRNA technology, a line he drew and held despite the isolation.
And she knew this was his reason?
Yes, he says she knew, and it didn't sit well with her. It created this deep, unspoken rift between them.
How did others around her react to his stance?
This is where it gets into ideology, it seems. He describes how, from the perspective of her vaccinated peers, he wasn't just abstaining, I was rejecting.
A rejection of them, almost.
That's how he felt they perceived it.
Okay.
And to be rejected by someone they saw as fringe, inferior, or delusional, he says that was intolerable. Yeah. Their view, he claims, was, I must be fixed. This cannot stand. Affection shouldn't be withheld from the righteous, especially not by a self-proclaimed pureblood.
Wow. Intense pressure.
And his response encapsulates his whole stance. But I am not theirs to fix. I am not a servant of sentiment nor a hostage of ideology. I am still free, if barely. A powerful declaration of autonomy against immense social force.
So how did his hostess react to this ongoing tension, this principled withholding?
Well, in what Chartrand saw as a response, maybe an attempt to prove something, she started hormone therapy. Testosterone.
Testosterone therapy, okay.
And possibly on her therapist's advice, she began this high-endurance training regimen that escalated quickly. He felt it became more than self-care. It was a campaign.
A campaign for what?
Perhaps validation, strength, desirability, it's unclear. But he observed signs of strain everywhere. He even notes her large dog injured himself trying to keep up with her new intense pace. He concluded it was simply unsustainable for them both. A path towards accelerated decline, in his view.
And this is where the Spikeopathies writing comes in, right?
Right.
It connects this directly to her health.
Yes, exactly. This is where we weave in the deeper medical context he explores in Spikeopathies, Flame in the Bone.
Yeah.
He introduces this term, Spikeopathies,
Okay.
which he defines as a chronic inflammatory condition triggered by persistent spike protein. And crucially, he believes this can come from either natural infection or mRNA vaccination. He presents this as a clinical observation he's made.
And he applies this directly to his hostess.
Yes. He describes her a practicing physician, he notes previously healthy, showing signs of deep systemic inflammation down to the bone marrow. And this started, he claims, shortly after she began that intense testosterone-supported exercise regime.
And crucially, after her vaccination.
He points that out explicitly. Her only major medical event in recent years was a full mRNA vaccination series.
Yep.
The symptoms he observed: pain, brain fog, fatigue, and dissociation, so severe that it's impairing her clinical judgment.
That sounds serious. Does he propose a mechanism for how this happens?
He does. He suggests a biological pathway, a kind of dangerous synergy. His theory is that testosterone itself is immunomodulatory. It affects the immune system.
Right.
And intense exercise, especially when the immune system is already, in his view, pre-activated by the vaccine, could actually amplify inflammatory responses or even reactivate latent spike proteins stored in the body, perhaps in the bone marrow.
So the combination of vaccine, testosterone, and intense exercise created this perfect storm, in his view.
That's his hypothesis. For him, it explains her decline. He sees her as a kind of canary in the biomedical coal mine, tragically illustrating his concerns.
Does he mention any treatments?
He does mention one controversial, unconventional treatment that apparently gave her notable relief. It involves CDS, chlorine dioxide solution, plus DMSO used as a topical spray.
CDS, that's controversial stuff, isn't it? Bleach-related.
It is highly controversial and not approved by mainstream medicine, often associated with dangerous health claims. Chartrand acknowledges its underground nature, but argues for its biochemically rational properties, suggesting DMSO acts as a carrier to get CDS through the skin, and that CDS has anti-inflammatory and oxidizing effects.
Okay, so this links back to his distrust of conventional medicine and his refusal of the inspection and detention.
Precisely. It shows his consistent skepticism and his willingness to explore alternatives, however fringe they may seem to the mainstream. This whole deep dive into her health, through his lens, shows how his exile wasn't just physical. It shaped his entire worldview, his medical understanding, his relationships. Maintaining that autonomy, even when it isolated him further, was paramount.
So how does this chapter, this final alliance, end for him?
It ends with that fundamental divergence. Her path of hormonal intervention and intense physical effort versus his path of discipline, austerity, and refusal of things he deemed compromised. These paths, he says, intersected at the fault lines of the body.
leading to inflammation for her, in his observation.
Yes. Inflammation. Bone deep, marrow hot, and cognitive, as he describes it, affecting thought and emotion. He insists he documented this not to shame, but to warn, not to gloat, but to grieve. Seeing her struggle is symptomatic of something larger.
And his own situation as a result.
His ultimate state, cast out, once again. Homeless not only in nation, but now in home. Dismissed for what I could not give or would not surrender. Made persona non grata for sticking to those core principles about health and autonomy.
And the purpose of writing all this down, his testimony.
He's very clear. This whole document, this dossier, isn't a cry for vengeance. He called it a fire signal.
A fire signal.
Yeah. He concludes with this almost prophetic statement. Something is burning in the marrow of our time, something ancient, something synthetic. And those of us who still feel the heat, we're not madmen. We are the smoke bearers.
Wow. That's a powerful ending. Smoke bearers, warning us.
Exactly. A call to attention, urging people to look beneath the surface.
So we've followed this incredible 5-year journey, fleeing Canada, undocumented in Mexico, navigating informal economies, facing betrayal, systemic obstacle,
Constant threats of erasure.
but also unwavering resilience, commitment to principles, that relentless pursuit of autonomy, even at immense personal cost.
And while his story is so unique, it really does touch on these universal themes, doesn't it? That search for recognition, for belonging.
Sure.
The impact of global events on individual lives, the sheer courage it takes to hold on to your convictions when everything pushes back.
It really makes you reconsider what citizenship means today, belonging in this, fluid, digital, often quite unforgiving world.
Absolutely.
Which leaves a question for you, our listener, to maybe chew on. What does it really mean to be free today, when borders aren't just lines on a map but digital walls, when health choices become so deeply political?
Yeah, and when even your personal space, your home, can become a battleground for these clashing ideologies and beliefs, leading to these kinds of ruptures.
And what are those hidden costs? The unrecognized costs of what society calls progress or compliance in a world that seems obsessed with sorting and categorizing us.
Martin Chartrand's fire signal, his story, it really challenges those conventional ideas, doesn't it? Citizenship, health, belonging. It pushes us to look beyond the easy answers, deep into the marrow, as he says, of the human experience today.
A challenging story, but an important one to consider. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.
Keep digging, keep questioning, and keep exploring the complexities.